Welcome to today's Harvard Business Review webinar, Creating a Culture of Data Visualization. I'm Angela Herron, Editor of Special Projects and Research at HBR, and I want to thank all of you for joining us today. And I want to thank Tibco Spotfire for making this discussion possible. Most companies today understand the power of using data and analytics, and they know that the ability to visualize complex data can allow everyone to better understand important information and get to faster decisions. And yet, many companies still struggle with just how to leverage data viz as a widespread organizational competency. We know that we all like visuals, but instead of creating a broad capability, we're often intimidated, and we use visualization as something that only a few people are able to do on a limited basis. But that doesn't have to be the case. HBR Senior Editor Scott Berinato is with us today to talk about how visualization can be easy to learn and be used broadly and effectively. In writing his great new book on data viz, Good Charts, and in working with companies around the country, Scott has developed a framework and a process for developing visualizations that lead to better problem solving and better, faster decisions. Scott, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Angela.
Scott, as I mentioned, you have been on the road with Good Charts for almost a year now.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about where you think companies are in their data visualization journeys.
Sure, yeah, I think people are getting it. And the more I hear and the more people I meet with, the more people are starting to see the urgency for understanding how to do this well. And every time I do a presentation with you or anybody, if somebody in the audience has heard me speak before, they'll know I have this imperative I always mention that companies that don't invest in this will fall behind, and companies that do invest in it will gain competitive advantages. You have to do it. There's just too much data out there now to not be able to make sense of it through visualization. And in a lot of presentations, I put this quote up from Daryl Morey of the Houston Rockets, who says that everybody in his business, the competitive world of basketball, knows they need to visualize, and they invest in it, and they're excited if they can use it right, and others use it wrong, which I think perfectly summarizes sort of that competitive imperative. But as I've talked to people, I've noticed something else about his quote that I didn't think of before, which is he was also saying it's easy to do poorly and they use it wrong. And I think a lot of people fear that, and a lot of people wonder if they are doing it poorly or they could be doing it better. And I think there is a reason for that, and there's a sort of a reason for that uncertainty that we still have. Even when you recognize the need to do this, you may worry that you're not doing it right or somebody's doing it better. And I think the reason is that we have what I like to call a unicorn problem. And I'm going to explain this sort of very deeply, so bear with me a little, but I also like lateral thinking. All right? I like for people to sort of jump the rails so they're not just sort of reading along with my bullet points and thinking about visualization. I'm going to create a metaphor here, and I'm going to ask you, help me out here and take a look at this picture and tell me what you think this is, just by taking a quick look. It's not the worst data viz in the world, it's something else. So.
It looks like a drawing for an outdoor garden.
Okay, not close, Angela, sorry. That's okay though. This is a detail from a patent application for the first synthesizer called the Telharmonium. Right about 1900 it was created, okay? Two people in the world knew how to build this and how to use this. And it was massive and expensive. It ran on 12 steam engines. Okay, that was the first synthesizer in the world. Highly specialized, very expensive, very few people in the world could use it, right? And then later on, people kept developing synthesizers. Yes, this is also a synthesizer from RCA called the Mark II, I believe. That looks like the worst band in the world there standing in front of it. But again, still very expensive, big. You have to be an expert to be able to use this. And you're not just going to go out and get one of these at the music store to start making music, right? And even in between, people tried other forms and other sort of experimental ways to make music electronically. This is called the Theremin, which a lot of people may be familiar with, but also a very specialized piece of equipment, a little bit more accessible, a little bit more useful. Some musicians started to use it. It's used in a lot of old movies, horror movies. That kind of spooky sound they created in horror movies was created with the Theremin. So getting a little better, getting a little more accessible, but still not really a general use kind of tool. And then something happened, and it's this. And everybody probably recognizes this, right? This is the Minimoog. This is the moment that synthesizers became something that were suddenly accessible to more people, enough people. And we call this the path to democratization. What happens is at some point, these things become cheap enough to acquire, cheap and easy, cheap enough to acquire and easy enough to use that a lot of people start adopting them, right? And when a lot of people start adopting them, they start asking for different features. They start using them in ways nobody anticipated. There's this sort of effect of experimentation when it gets out there, right? And it creates what I think of as like a switchback, a virtuous switchback, right? So a company innovates and creates the Minimoog. You see that there on the bottom left. Users adopt that, and then they say, hey, this is great, but we'd love if you added different modes for it. And then the company adds different modes, and more people buy that Minimoog or the second generation Minimoog. And they say, this is great, but I want to be able to save some of my things. They add more innovation, more adoption, more innovation, more adoption, until you get to a point where the thing is so cheap and easy that everybody's using it, and you end up with synth pop, right? So synth pop is actually a product of the democratization of synthesizers, of this technology. Synth pop could not have happened with the Theremin. It could not have happened with the Telharmonium. It had to be a point where this stuff was cheap enough to use and easy enough to acquire that a lot of people could do it and did do it in bad hair and all. And so you ended up with an entire genre of music based on the democratization of this tool. Okay? And today we've sort of even gone past that. Digitization has moved it even further beyond. Tools like GarageBand and others allow us to store hours and hours and hours of sample music, mash it together, cut it up, paste it very quickly, very differently than we ever could before. So that sort of process continues to this day and gets more and more powerful all of the time. So this idea of democratization, Angela, is sort of all around us, even if we don't think about it. And a couple of tech examples I was thinking about as I was doing this were, like HTML sort of democratized digital publishing in a way that anybody could create a website, right? And the democratizing moment you remember from that, the synth pop moment, was GeoCities websites. When people created their own websites with the crazy backgrounds and the spinning heads and all that sort of garishness. And word processing went through this in the early 80s, when suddenly anybody could sort of create a newsletter on their home computer, which was unheard of. Printing was very complicated before that. Suddenly you saw all these homespun newsletters sort of jump out of nowhere, and a lot of them had 35 fonts and all kinds of crazy decoration. But it was certainly a moment in time we all remember where suddenly this tool became accessible. Content management, something we think about at HBR, Medium is the democratization of content management, right? It's very easy for me to actually start a digital magazine or a publishing platform with some of these tools that have made it sort of cheap enough to acquire and easy enough to use that I can do it myself. And right now I think we're going through it with live broadcasts as well. If you think about Facebook Live and some of these other platforms, allow anybody to actually go live at any time. This is something that used to require trucks with antennas and parabolic satellite dishes and things like that, and now people are doing it from their phones. So we see this all of the time, right? And data visualization is no different. It's gone through this democratizing moment. And I'll take you through it really quickly, right? It's kind of nice. I chose synthesizers sort of on purpose, one, because I think they're cool, but also because the timeline is very similar for visualization as it is, just a coincidence, but as it is for synthesizers. So in the early 1900s, you had companies, this is sort of the analytics department of the tabulating machine company, right? This is their analytics platform. And it's a bunch of people who are creating cards, punching cards, storing cards logically in that drawer. And then they would take those cards and bring them over to a draftsman, spread them out on a table, talk about the story they wanted to tell, and then create charts out of all of that information, right? A huge team effort. A lot of work went into it. Some of the larger companies of the time, the railroads, utility companies, these big companies saw the value in doing this and really invested in doing it well, right? But it was still, you needed experts, you needed a lot of people, and it was very expensive to do. Not everybody could do it, right? And at the time, it was really powerful and created these really beautiful, amazing, hand-drawn visualization done by draftsmen, highly skilled, highly prized by these big companies, who could create these charts. Some of them we think of as new, like here's a heat map. The previous one was an organization flow chart. There's all kinds of, this is a very sophisticated dual-axis timeline. They were doing crazy, sophisticated things with that highly specialized talent, but it wasn't available to everybody. It's like the Telharmonium or the Theremin or the RCA Mark II, right? In the 50s, it got a little more accessible, but people were still relying on experts to analyze the data and crunch it and then draw it as well. And this is from a book by Mary Eleanor Spear, where she talks a lot about the government's investment. Now imagine the government has a lot of resources to invest in this. This is a tool called the Economic Analyzer. I have no idea how it works. It seems to have a lot of knobs and switches, but Again, you had to be something in the know, somewhat of in the know, and have a lot of money to invest in something like this to take advantage of it. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics actually had a room they called OSCAR, the Operating Statistical Chart Analysis Room. Again, a big investment to have an entire room devoted to the statistical analysis, charts and all of that, but still a little more accessible than previous generations.
But it just strikes me that you're at this point, there's still, it's limited to a relatively small group of people who can make these charts, and it's a relatively small group of people who can understand these charts.
That's correct, yes. It's still a small group of experts and enthusiasts, not even so much enthusiasts at this point, really a small group of experts who have the resources to invest to make it happen, right? But then something happened, and this is what happened. This is the Minimoog of data visualization, right? This was the moment where things became cheap enough to acquire, pie charts became cheap enough to acquire, and the tools to make pie charts were easy enough to use that anybody could do it, right? And it's beautiful. Like we forget now, but at the time, people looked at this and said, wow, I can make a bar chart, I can make it 3D, I can put it in this glass box here, I can do all these things and change the colors. And they did. They just went nuts with this, right? And it created some good outcomes and some not so good outcomes, right? But that's a pro. I think of that as a pro. Anyone can use it. That democratizing moment is great. It's wonderful. It's a pro that anybody can use these tools. I also think it's a con, right? There's also some challenges when anybody is using it. You get this sort of synth pop moment, right? Where there's a lot of people doing it and most of it's not very good, right? And that's okay. It has to happen. But most of it's not very good, right? What you ended up with Chart Wizard, people will recognize some of these, this sort of default output, which isn't very intuitive, actually doesn't get you to visual meaning very quickly, but you got those charts out so quickly, you felt like a magician, and you could walk into the boardroom with something really colorful and convince your boss you were doing some great stuff, right? And today, the platforms, just like with synthesizers, have moved on to GarageBand and other digital tools. We have entire platforms, TIBCO and others, where you can store all of your data, you can store all of your charts, you can manipulate them, you can make them update in real time. It's really powerful stuff, right? I can create hundreds of charts in seconds. It's amazing. I have repositories everywhere. This is one of my repositories where I'm just manipulating this stuff all of the time. And it's so easy to do. And even 20 years ago, this would have been impossible in a full-time job in and of itself, right? And 50 years ago, forget about it, right? You had to be a draftsman with a team of 7 to do this kind of thing, right? But here's the message I really want to get across today, right? Just because I can do it doesn't mean I should do it, right? And just because something's easy, that doesn't make it good. And as you know with good charts, it's always about what is good, what is a good chart, right? And a good chart communicates information effectively, efficiently, in the context it's presented, right? So people don't have to work to see it, or they don't get confused, or they don't get misled, right? So we have to think about can does not equal should, and easy does not equal good, right? I can create this chart very easily. I can do this. I did this one in 2 clicks. It was really 2 clicks. I had my data. I clicked, I put them together, and I was done, right? I can do that. I probably shouldn't present this. And in other presentations, I've shown why this is a really bad chart to present. I should do something more like this, which requires a different kind of thinking and a different level of investment in time to make sure that what I'm presenting is understood and usable by my audience, right? This is easy to do. This is a tree map. This is a problem I worked on with one company where they had different business units rated over time on their effectiveness. I think it was a 1 to 5 scale. It doesn't matter. And this is every business unit in that company rated. And they put this tree map on a dashboard, because it looks cool. It's sort of interesting. It's kind of pretty. But it was really not conveying the meaning it needed to. So we worked through the problem of how do we make this more useful to people so they're not just looking at it and saying, cool, that's nice, you can do that with your fancy software, but I'm not getting any value out of it. And we worked through the problem, and we came up with an entirely different approach. Same data, and this is now the visual they can use. Believe it or not, it's the same data. So people wanted to know from this, they wanted to understand where is my score and how am I doing against other people. And that's really hard to do here, right? And then over time as well. So we put that in here. Your score is the blue dot, and the darkest blue dot is the most recent score. As they get lighter, they are further in the past. And everybody else are the gray dots, right? So now pretty immediately I can see where I stand in the organization compared to other people. And we've also added that thick blue line to sort of show where baseline is. You really want to be above that line. So without much thinking, if this is on a dashboard, I say, hey, look, my group is not only improving remarkably, we've also passed that threshold of what's sort of acceptable, right? A completely different view into the same data. So what's easy isn't necessarily what's good. And what you can do doesn't mean what you should do, right?
Now, I have to stop because someone asked, you mentioned the word investment. So when the ability to make the much better chart, did that because they had better technology? They invested in better technology, or they invested in better data scientists? Why? What did it take to get from?
We're gonna get to that, but I will tell you, it's not the technology for sure, and it's not investing in better data scientists. You want good data scientists, don't get me wrong. It's something else entirely, and we're about to talk about that. So if they can hold tight, I promise to get there. This is the problem with democratization that I was talking about, right? It's sort of necessary and useful. It's good. I love it, but it's inefficient. We end up creating a lot more stuff, but not a lot more good stuff, right? And so when companies start to invest in data visualization, they think all the tools are there, it's pretty easy to do, I'll just get some people and they'll start doing it, and they think they're going to get the people who are in that dark blue box there, when oftentimes they get the people in the light blue box, who can create things quickly, but aren't thinking through the challenges of making an effective communication, right? Everybody wants the unicorns. Everybody wants the people who can not only do this, but do it well, and know how to do it really well. And the executives I've talked to in the last year, there's a certain level of actually complaining to me sometimes. It's sort of interesting. They'll say, look, we were told big data was a big issue. We were told we needed data scientists. We built platforms upon platforms. We invested millions of dollars. I've got all this data. I bought all the software they told me to. I hired the data scientists. I put them in the basement. I told them to crunch the numbers and come up with it. And I'm not getting results for that. I don't know what I'm getting. I'm getting a dashboard, and I look at it, and it's kind of nice, but I'm not getting the results I want. I really want something more, right? And what they're saying to me, really, I think, is they're saying, look, I want a design thinking, data wrangling, subject matter knowing unicorn, right? They're looking for the one guy or a few people who can just do this, who not only know how to do the software, who not only know how to clean the data and analyze the data, and those are two totally different things, but then also can take meaning from the data and present it in a meaningful way. That's a lot to ask of any one person, right? It's just, it doesn't really work that way, right? And so you end up with things like this. This is one of my favorite pictures. The data scientist has all the data. The data scientist has a lot of information. The data scientist wants to show how much information they have. But it's hard to get meaning out of something like this. And we want to avoid this, right? The presentation layer has to be thought through of what is going to be effective communication, not as what will show my data, right? Unicorns don't exist. That's sort of my belief. I had to put mostly there. My daughter made me put mostly there because she's not convinced yet. So I said, okay, I'll put mostly on there. Mostly unicorns don't exist. There are a few people who actually are kind of lateral thinkers, polymaths, who can do a lot of these different things together. But for the most part, going to find those people is sort of a losing game. There's a better way to do it. And so instead of saying I need a design thinking, data wrangling, subject matter knowing unicorn, I'm saying what you need is a design thinker and a data wrangler and a subject matter expert, right? You need a team. And this seems not quite facile, but it's pretty obvious. But you'd be surprised at how many people I talk to who just don't think in terms of how do I put together a team to challenge to figure out my data viz challenges. How do I get the data analysis people talking to the subject matter experts and then connecting with the design creative folks to actually create the output we need. Even on an ongoing basis, if I'm trying to build dashboards or testing a hypothesis, how do I put those teams together? People aren't quite thinking that way, I think, sometimes. And one of the things that's sort of really interesting to me is this team approach, which seems somewhat new and interesting, is actually not at all new and interesting. If you remember, when the technology didn't make it cheap and easy, before democratization, you had to use a team to visualize. And people saw the value of creating teams. Teams of 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 people work together to create those amazing hand-drawn, drafted charts because the companies recognize the value in investing in the visual output, right? And even in the 50s, Mary Eleanor Spear, the woman who had those great pictures from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in one of her books, she just says, this is how you set it up. She's not saying, I think maybe you should try a team approach. In her book, she's saying, well, obviously you need at least these 3 people, and here's a sort of division of their jobs. You need a communicator. That's sort of your subject matter expert. The graphic analyst we can think of as the data analyst, and the draftsman is the visualizer, right? So for a long time, people were thinking about this in terms of teams, not in terms of I've got the data, so I should be the one who just has to, click the buttons in my software and get a chart out, right? They were thinking about how to do this. Even at HBR, we sort of adopted this approach, right? Between editors and others. I worked on a piece recently that's highly visual. It was a visual narrative, but the way boards of directors were connected throughout the last 40 or 50 years. And so this visualization represents about 200 of the largest companies in the world, and every time they share a board member, we drew a line between them, right? And the gray lines show sort of intra-regional, and the red lines in the middle show international connections. And when you see this outlay over time, it really tells a compelling and amazing story. But did somebody say to me, yes, Scott, go do that story, and you figure out the visualization and you make it happen? No, we had a team, right? We put together a team to make this happen. I consider myself the subject matter expert. We had a designer who knows some information design as well, named Marta, and a developer. And we would sit together and work together through the challenges of how to show this information, good ways to show it, the limitations of the software and the data we had to make sure we weren't making any leaps, and then how to sort of refine it with design as well. But we're not the only ones. A lot of this sort of teamwork that we've done, we've borrowed on from other folks that I talked to in the course of making the book. This is an example I like to give all the time. It's a little bit older now, but still totally pertinent. Boeing has a bird strike issue. They don't want birds to crash into planes, and they had lots of data devoted to sort of figuring out this problem, and they moved to a team-based approach to their visual challenges. And they would literally sit together and say, look, I need to see all of this information. Now you can imagine the subject matter expert who doesn't really know the software is trying to navigate. You have hundreds of types of birds. You have dozens of chart type possibilities. These have charts overlaid on a map. You can turn variables on and off. It's kind of a waste of time for that subject matter expert to stop and learn the software, when that subject matter expert could just rely on somebody who knows the software and they can work together. And he can say, I just want to show me all the bird strikes everywhere by prevalence and bird type. And then they go back and forth and say, well, actually, you know what? I need to know the time of day birds are hitting planes as well. So you get that. And then, so, maybe we can combine those two views, right? And they're working together to get to a better outcome, an outcome like this, which actually combines prevalence of bird strike by location. They got rid of type of bird. It turned out it didn't matter. And by time of day. And you can actually gain some great insights by that. Surprisingly, at dusk and dawn, there's very few bird strikes. And at night and during the middle of the day, there's a lot more. So they can start to make better decisions, better changes to takeoff and landing protocols based on this kind of teamwork. And then when they need to talk to the executives, they can bring the design team in and say, we need something really simple because, executives. And say, look, they need to know where on the plane birds are hitting, and we could give them a table, we could give them something really complicated, but a designer can think of really effective ways to reduce that message to its simplest sort of form like this as well. Right? So when you put these teams together, like I said, you really want these people to work together in an agile way. And I actually would suggest even looking at agile methodologies. Can you sort of do sprints? Can you look at ways to sort of box the work? But be agile. Think on your feet. You want these people to work together to solve little problems, not to say we're going to create the master dashboard for the company and then go. You want to solve each little problem along the way with some strategy for how you're going to get to the big outcome, right? I found it really useful to actually have people sit together. And this is sort of really interesting how often this just doesn't happen because the data science people are on floor 7 and the subject matter experts are in building C or whatever. But if these people are really trying to solve a problem, use their data to come up with some visual explanation or visual solutions or even confirm or refute hypotheses, sitting together makes all the difference in the world. Right?
Are you suggesting that this data scientist or the chart experts actually are sort of embedded in the group?
Correct, yes. And they can go back and forth. Maybe sometimes the subject matter expert sits with the data scientist. Maybe sometimes the data scientist comes and sits with the subject matter expert or the designer, depending on where you are in the process. And oftentimes what happens is you'll have the subject matter expert and the analysis, kind of working together to a point until they get to the point where they think they have the visual solution worked out, and then they'll bring in the sort of communication, the information designer or somebody else, and then they sit together, so. And the third thing I think is really important is to just learn about each other. And some companies I've talked to have done this. They've made their information designers take statistics courses, right? And they make their data scientists take design courses, right? Which I think is a fantastic idea. Just understanding not only what somebody else does, but how they do it can really help you avoid some of the sort of miscommunications or language barriers about how you operate with data or with visuals. Just learn about what these other people are doing. It's sort of, if you're a curious person, it's easy, but it's really important for people to not think from their perspective only. If I'm the information designer, just think it has to be this way, without understanding, the statistical reasons why that may be misleading or that may not be the best way to do it. Then you can overcome some of that if you just take the time, whether it's formally or informally, to learn about what the other does and how they actually do their job, right? All of this is to say teams are good, right? We love teams. And that's sort of my simple summation of what I've been hearing over the past year with good charts. So that's sort of the formal presentation, but I'm hoping there's bunches of questions.
Yeah,
and we can get going.
And I see they fall in some buckets, so let me start with the one I see a lot. And people are very enthusiastic, but a lot of people who are listening are obviously time pressured. They have a lot of different things they've got to get done. So they want you to talk a little bit about how much time does this take? One person, let's just start with the Boeing example. Did it take weeks, months to get to that drawing? And aren't you also proposing something that's going to take a lot of time inside an organization?
Yes, it does take time. I'm arguing the time, there's value to taking that extra time, right? That your outcomes will be so much better that the extra investment is worth it. In the Boeing case, they had been working on that in a non-teamwork sort of approach where they were throwing things over the wall and it was taking months and they were getting nowhere. And then in a matter of weeks, they had some solutions to the problems by working this way. In general, I think sort of adopting an agile sort of approach to it will also help with the time. When you break down your challenges to smaller bits of challenges, rather than say we're going to take on the entire dashboard, just say, okay, first we're going to take on primary information we need in the dashboard and figure out that challenge. Finish that challenge and then move on to the next one. If it becomes sort of a way of working that way, it doesn't seem so daunting. But I will say, the investment is worth it. I've seen it over and over again. When people work this way, they get to better outcomes faster. And they make better decisions because they're getting better information out, better visualizations that help them make decisions better. So yes, it's an extra investment, and yes, you should make it.
So someone made the observation, your team approach is something similar to the key element of the advertising revolution in the 60s when copywriters and art directors were paired to build on each other's strengths, which is kind of an interesting way of going at it.
Yeah,
but now reel it on back. When people are sitting down to this, are you suggesting that the conversation they're having when they first sit down is to identify the problem or to say, here's the answers that I want? Talk a little bit about what the initial conversation is like.
Yeah, and this is all in the book too, but there are different visualization challenges. So let's start with the simple one, where I need to present a visual to a boss in a meeting or something. I have an idea of what the data says. I have an idea of what I want them to know. That's a simpler challenge. It won't take as much time. And that is, you're just sitting down and saying, okay, how are we going to show this, right? We have the data, we know the data. We're not actually exploring the data. We're sort of making a statement out of it. And that one is really going to be the tools expert, the designer, and the subject matter expert sitting down together, and you can get to that pretty rapidly. We promise in the book in a couple of hours you can get to better outcomes.
So they already know what the story is.
They already sort of have an idea of the story. As they sort of sketch out their possibilities, and that's what I would say you do in that case is there's a talk, sketch, prototype process to that. You may, alter your story a little, but that's a pretty rapid process and can be done pretty quickly. Now, the bigger, sort of more interesting challenge is I have hypotheses, or I'm exploring data, or I have terabytes of data, and I don't even know what I'm looking for yet, right? And so that's where you still need to have some kind of approach where you're starting to form hypotheses and you're asking each other questions. So the subject matter expert will say, can you show me, like in the bird strike example, can you show me where birds hit by what type of bird? And they'll say, yeah, I can do that. Let me pull that up. You look at it and you go, okay, that's not quite what I need. I'm really trying to figure out sort of if we can identify the most likely time birds are going to hit planes. And then that tools expert will say, well, do you need to know the type of bird or does it not matter? Because I can actually filter for that. And you go back and forth that way. You're actually sort of interviewing each other. It's like a sort of a pilot navigator thing, right? One person is steering and the other person is saying, we really should sort of veer left here. The other person says, well, if we veer left, we're going to hit turbulence, so we might want to not do that. And it's a conversation back and forth, sort of interviewing each other about it in that way.
So someone says, well, do you have examples of how value was actually added with new visualizations, like here's how the business was managed with poor views and here's how we improve with better insights? I think this is a whole stream of questions about, well, I believe you, but I got to convince my boss this is a good investment.
Right. I think the one of the easy wins I've seen, and I showed a very small example of it there with that tree map, is dashboards, right? One of the first things data science groups do is they set up dashboards for the bosses so they can see all this data coming in real time and it's beautiful and there's lots of pretty things on the screen and they're changing all the time and it's fantastic. A lot of the executives I talk to sort of say, yeah, they're cool, and I look at them and then I kind of stop looking at them after a few weeks and maybe I'll go back now and again, but they're not getting the value out of the dashboards they had hoped. And I think that's actually a great place for early wins is, can you, and there's lots of literature out there about designing better dashboards and more effective dashboards. Can you take everything you're showing on the dashboard and really put it through this process to figure out if you're showing exactly what you need to be showing to help them make better decisions? Like I said with that simple tree map example, it was really hard to use that, so nobody did, right? But now that they have a version where you can actually see where you stand against other people in the organization, that's usable, and so people will use that. You know, they will actually be able to reference that to know how they're doing and then to show other people how they're doing as well.
You referenced at the beginning of our discussion that this was really an imperative for companies that want to maintain a competitive edge. Exactly how do you think that visualization helps them get that competitive edge? And is that also true for units or even managers inside companies?
It is, yes. I think I always say the companies that invest in this will do better than the companies that don't, and the individuals that invest in getting a little better will have sort of better career arcs than those that think it's not for me, I'll just get somebody else to do it. You know, at least learning a little bit about the visualization process is really going to help you communicate all of your data, and we all have too much data. It's how business runs now, right? It's all we have, and so the ability to even once, and I've heard this story over and over again from people who say, I wasn't a visualization guy, but I had this idea and I made it come to life, and suddenly I became the person at the company that everybody came to solve their visual challenges. You hear that story over and over again. It's really important for folks to do that. In terms of examples of companies using this, I can just tell you very briefly, you know, companies like the auto companies are now using visualization not only to market better and to understand their customers better, but to engineer their cars better, because they can collect a lot of data from the cars now, which in a table form is unusable, but in visual form can show them how people drive their cars, how they treat them, when they service them, how they apply the brakes, how they punch on the gas, right? So engineering is a discipline where you're always building to the ideal case, how people should drive. Now they can engineer cars to how people actually do drive. So that's another example of how this will pay off.
So it sounds like you really get the payoff, though, if you make it an organizational competence so that every unit, every division can use it. But how do you make that happen? Is that something that has to come from the top? Because you are talking about, as we said before, some investment in people, certainly in time and in technology.
Yeah, I think there has to be a leadership mandate. There has to be some investment. But I expect increasingly to see firms arise that specialize in this for other companies who will come in and consult with them on getting this up to speed, right? Some of the consulting firms are already doing this. They got better at visualization themselves because a lot of what they're doing is communicating data to clients and making sure clients are happy with their work, right? Because they need to get paid. And they've gotten so good at it that they're starting to offer it as a service to others, that they've gotten so good at this sort of visualization game. They're saying, well, not only are we showing you these really good charts that help you make decisions, we can help your company set up a similar thing inside as well.
Someone else asked, there's an important, it's a skill and a valuable skill for an individual to have and actually sort of hold this expertise. But how do you find the balance between sort of self-service using the technology and then going to others? Do you recommend people have a basic skill in creating charts, or should they always rely on the chart maker and the data scientist? How do you find the balance?
Yes, some people will take to it and want to learn more, and that's fine. I totally encourage that. I think you need at least a basic fluency in chart types, chart forms, when to use this kind of chart versus that kind of chart. And a lot of that can be had through books like my own and others. Through some literature, some continuing ed, there's lots of data visualization opportunities now. Some basic design is usually integrated into it as well. What I promise people and I tell people is don't feel intimidated. I think a lot of people say, I kind of want to get better, but as an individual, I'm intimidated. I look out in the world and people are constantly judging other people's charts. They're making fun of their colors or however they executed something. Stay away from that world. It's not productive. It's not useful. There are ways to get a little bit better and more fluent without sort of engaging in that. And you don't need to be so obsessed with the rules and getting it right and getting it wrong. Really, if you can get to an outcome where people are understanding your information better, even if it breaks a few of the rules, I think that's fantastic.
Several people have asked you to talk a little bit about how you think about complex charts versus the simpler, more easy to grasp charts, and how you make decisions on it. And are you? I suppose someone is sort of saying, are you in favor of more complex charts?
So a rule of thumb I use is if the person is fluent in the subject we're talking about.
You're talking about the audience.
The audience, sorry,
okay,
yes.
Yeah.
If the audience is fluent in the subject we're talking about and fluent in the chart type we're using, then I have a little more leeway to be a little more complex with my visual than if they are looking at say a tree map for the first time, have never seen this in this context, don't know what it is, and also aren't sure of what you're talking about in terms of whether it's sort of units shipped or whatever it happens, might be. So sort of more conversant your audience is and what you're talking about, the more leeway you have. But in general, I'm a minimalist and I'm a simplist. I like simple. And I always look for opportunities to make even what looks like a relatively simple chart into 2 or 3 simpler charts. I really like to use a setup, a storytelling methodology where you sort of set it up with the simplest thing possible and then add layers on top of it step by step. It really, really helps with the audience's sort of understanding of what you're trying to say. You'd be surprised, even somewhat simple looking charts can have 20, 25 entry points where people might choose to focus first. And if they haven't been executed very well, then you're going to have 5 or 6 people in the audience looking at 5 or 6 different things. If you can control that flow and force them to look at one thing at a time, it really helps with their understanding of what you're trying to say. And it's a really fun challenge and powerful way to present charts.
Actually, you've hit on a vein that people are asking, which is, can you talk a little bit more about storytelling with charts, how you would actually persuade with charts? Someone else said, can you talk about how to make it actionable?
Yes, so storytelling, we have a whole section of the book on that too, but I think people get wrapped up in storytelling as this sort of beautiful, flowery narrative, right? But all we mean by storytelling is 3 steps. We mean setup, conflict, and resolution. And conflict doesn't have to be negative. All this means is setup is here's some reality, here's some visual story, here's some visual idea. Conflict is here are changes to that idea. And the resolution is here's what results from that changes. Almost any chart you can think of can be broken down into this storytelling structure. And in fact, multiple charts and big data sets can definitely be broken down into this. And I encourage people to try that even with simple charts. How would I set this up? What would I introduce in the visual as conflict? And then how would I show the resolution? And it can be broken down into very small steps. In the book, we take a very simple chart about 2 years of peanut butter prices. It looks like the simplest thing ever, and we break it into 6 smaller charts. So this can be done. It can be reduced into this sort of narrative flow where you're carrying people along. And I forget the second part of that question. Apologies.
I think it was more about making the data actionable. And this came off a question. Yeah. Several people said, the problem with dashboards is that they tend to just be a lot of math and statistics.
Yeah.
So, and then no wonder that the executives feel like they're not getting optimization. So how can you do a better job of dashboards so that people can actually include things like scenarios for possible outcomes or something more that helps them funnel toward a decision?
So dashboards are a very sort of specific and complicated area that we could go on and on about. I would say one thing that I've heard a lot of companies doing now is interviewing the people who are using the dashboards as they're creating them and saying, what do you need? What do you need to know? When do you need to know that change is significant? When something happens, when should I sort of alert you that you might want to take notice of this, to try to understand what are the goals of the organization? Not what can you show me or what data do we have, what is the idea that you need to see every morning, and when will it be important for you to know that something with that idea has changed? And start to actually, instead of just saying, well, you've got all the data, go build me my dashboard, pushing back on the executives and saying, well, let me know, tell me how I can help you, help me to help you.
Can you talk a little bit about how you decide to pick the information for a chart so that you tell a simple story and you don't take people down the wrong path?
Yeah.
I think they said this is the too many options problem that I have when I design a chart.
Yeah, so in the process I talk about in the book, there's a process up front. A lot of your best charts are actually designed before there ever is even a visual.
Wait, what do you mean?
I mean, if you start by, instead of just sitting down and saying, I'm going to make this a bar chart now, and we talk about your challenge, what are you trying to show me with this data, Angela, right? If we start talking and I start listening, I'm going to hear visual words, I'm going to hear visual cues, and I'm also going to hear sentences that describe what you need to show. I need them to see that the revenue decline started earlier than they think. Right? So if I get somebody to that point where they're making statements like that, right, I can capture those sentences, and then as I'm building the visual, I can see if the visual reflects that and only that, or if that message is fighting with another. If I can show that revenue decline, but for some reason I have 12 years of historical data, I can say to myself, does this 12 years of historical data help me to explain this revenue decline that I said was important? And if it doesn't, we can kill it, and we can start to simplify.
So wait, I want to go back on this. So
Sure.
It sounds like, are you saying that and sometimes we come with all this data, but we may be actually arriving at the table with the wrong pile of data?
Sometimes the wrong pile, sometimes too much, oftentimes too much. Oftentimes what we do is we highlight the cells, the row B or column A or whatever, we highlight those and say just make that into a bar chart or something.
Well, that's because we learned how to do it with our little Excel.
Right, because it's very easy to do, right?
Okay.
It's that easy thing. And we haven't thought through, well, do they really need to know, do they really need to see all of that, right? And so if you start by knowing your data and just having a conversation about it, I need them to see this revenue decline started earlier than they think, you can start sort of comparing what you produce to that statement and say, is that's what reflected here? Is another message fighting with that message? Is another message drowning that message out? Are there ways for me to highlight that message and minimize other messages? And again, we talk about all of this and some of the techniques to do that in the book as well.
If you're making that presentation, in this case, would you have those charts that show that other information in your back pocket?
So a lot of people ask about this because executives like completeness, right?
Right, because if you're asked a question, you want to be ready to have that chart, right?
So show them the simplest thing you can. Present them with something that's more complicated. Context, right? In a meeting, I have about 300 milliseconds to get their attention and get them to understand my chart before they start looking at their phone or asking questions about it or forming their opinions about it, right? On a piece of paper by themselves, eye to paper, where they can spend more time, we can afford to make something a little more complicated, a little more in depth, and then maybe present them the data too. But I say this every time because I know, I've heard this over and over. It's like my boss wants like the crazy busy chart, I say, well, put it on a piece of paper for him, but show him the simpler thing. Over time, he'll figure it out. But put it on that piece of paper, but just don't give them the paper before you present. Present first and then say, I'll give you the complete data afterwards, because if you give them the paper and then you start presenting, they'll flip through the paper and sort of ignore you, right? Because that's a sort of one-to-one interaction. So have it ready. Make it complete, make it busy, even if you think this is a terrible chart, there's way too much information here. If it makes them feel good about themselves, that's part of your job. But present them the best thing that's going to help them make decisions, even if they don't know it.
So, you've kind of started to make the point in that discussion that customer experience is really key.
Yes.
But different customers have different reactions. So are you suggesting that if you're trying to explain a problem or an issue to the whole company, you may actually have different charts and different stories to tell different units? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, in general, the bigger your audience, the harder it is to set a very specific context, right? So you have to be more generalist and you have to be sort of safer with the message you're sending. It has to be even clearer and you can't make as many assumptions. If I'm presenting to my unit, we all have things we know, we have a language we speak, we have ideas we talk about every day that I can almost gloss over. I can include that information in the visual and they can see it and understand it and not have to think about it. If I'm presenting the same information to the entire company or to customers and they say, well, what's the LRI line? Well, what does that mean? You have to, well, LRI is logistical retention, and then you're lost because then they're trying to think of, okay, I have to remember this information, then I have to look at that information on the screen, figure out what it means on that line, and then connect it to the other, so you're lost, right? So in general, the bigger your audience, the safer you sort of have to be with your context, and the more simple charts will help you. I'd rather have 7 simple charts than one chart that tries to tell the whole story.
A lot of people want us to go back to that discussion of resources. Talk a little bit more about the strengths and abilities of these key team roles that you were talking about, and is there a way that 2 people can be compressed into one? Because a lot of people are talking about the fact that they don't know how much they've really got to be able to bring on extra staff for this.
Yes, I often say find the enthusiasts first in your company, right? So somebody like me, I'm a subject matter expert. I guess you'd call me at HBR, right? I'm an editor, but I have this interest in visualization. So I'm not quite 2, I'm like 1.43 or something. But I know enough about the visualization and I know enough about the subject matter that you're getting sort of more bang for your buck. And every company will have those enthusiasts who are just interested in visual challenges, and you should identify them and encourage it and give them money to take courses and learn and try out software and tools and be that person for sure. As well, I think when I talked about, get to know each other, having your data scientists take design classes and having your designers take statistics classes starts to sort of improve that ratio. So you're not dealing with people whose knowledge is completely independent, and they can start to work together in a more productive way. So definitely some cross-training helps as well.
Are you kind of visualizing a time when there'll be almost everybody in the organization will be put through some of this training?
I think it's a great idea for a lot of companies, yes. But the more data intensive your company, and every company is data intensive, I think the more important it is. I mean, I guess people, even small data is pretty big now, right? Because we can retain it for so long and we can, it's all in sort of standard formats. So even, your marketing data, there's just too much to make any use of it without sort of learning how to do this on an ongoing basis and building up those skills. So yeah, I think at some point it will be reasonably common. It ought to be, yeah.
Someone says, well, Scott has he's made the point that simple is better, but he hasn't talked about whether or not there's ever a time to use interactive charts that has a lot of bells and whistles.
There is. Interactivity, I believe, can be very powerful. Bring a developer in.
Are most organizations ready for it, really?
Not really, and bring a UX person in. What ends up happening is people make things interactive just to catch the eye, right? The real value of interactivity is the selective disclosure of information. So the ability to turn labels on and off, the ability to highlight information and then bring it back down and highlight other information in the space of one chart. This kind of interactivity is crucial both to our workloads, right? Because with interactivity I can make 7 of those simple charts in one chart and then just have a button that sort of lets me toggle through my views or so on and so forth. So the deployment of it sort of smartly is going to be super valuable. There are very few people who have thought through that yet, and it's going to take some time, but it's a worthy investment if you can get some UX and developer talent to start thinking about ways to make those dashboards actionable, for example. Or I've even seen in some cases with some of these data analysis platforms, you can make presentations interactive by presenting a really well done chart, from a data analysis software, but that is completely interactive, so somebody in the audience can raise their hand and say, can I see that same thing but for last year? And you say, stand by, you click it through, and then you get another nice well-designed chart that shows that information. You start comparing. It has the potential to make even presentations less of me telling you what the pictures are and us talking about what is in the pictures. It's
But do you
really
also run the
powerful.
risk of being entertaining versus actionable?
The biggest danger with interactivity, I can't stress it enough, and animation and all of that, is that you're making things fly around just to catch people's eyes. It creates that eye candy problem. I like the term eye candy because candy is sort of immediately satisfying and then leaves you with a headache. It's the same thing. You sort of see it and you go, wow, that's cool. I have no idea what it means. And then you sort of get annoyed and frustrated and you kind of start dismissing it. So really don't want to deploy interactivity just to sort of catch eyes.
We have several questions, people asking about what are the risks that you have when you're creating a visualization that you may be introducing your personal bias. Now that said, we all know that if you come to a conclusion, you've got a bias that this is the correct answer. So
Right.
talk a little bit about how you make sure that you're not introducing bias and how you avoid some of those dangers of misleading people or presenting misconceptions.
Yeah, I think it's always good to have a buddy to run your visualizations by who can check you on this, right? This is what we do as editors, right? I don't just edit something and say, let's publish it, it's perfect. We have other people look at it and say, no, that didn't quite work the way you did that, and here's why. So having those people sort of available to you, and as you train more people in your organization, that sort of naturally happens, is really important. But the other thing is we have to be better, we have to become more data viz literate as consumers, right? We have to be able to suss those things out for ourselves, not only in our own work, but in other people's work. So now when I see, a chart with a dual y-axis, two different y-axes in the same space, which I find hugely problematic, I have sort of taught myself the right things to wonder about that and to make sure I'm thinking through what those two axes actually are and is this misleading me? And as we become better consumers, sort of more literate with visualization, people will call us out on those kinds of challenges. So I think that's important as well.
That's interesting because we have someone who just asked, well, do you actually find that you stage your presentation so you get feedback about the charts from the audience, and do you actually try to create time so you can find out what's befuddling the audience? Love that word, befuddle.
Yes, I do. I just did a presentation on something at work, and I had all the presentation was all laid out, and I had all my charts, and I actually had somebody who was familiar with the project we were working on sort of look at every chart, and actually I presented it to them and said, this is how I'm thinking of presenting it, and they reacted. They said, I don't get why are you telling me that? This doesn't seem important, or why is the picture saying that but you're saying this, and is that really the best way? Should you really use a unit chart here? And we just had it back and forth. It was 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes, and made a few adjustments to my charts based on it, and I think that's a really good exercise. I hope people when they're presenting are practicing their presentations anyway, and this just becomes sort of integrated into that as well, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah.
Several people want to know if this is a good job field to be entering. One person asked, is this a place with somebody with a strong liberal arts bent could maybe add value in a business setting?
No, I was just talking to the president of a very large data analysis software company, and he said he finds that liberal arts majors make the best sort of bridge between data analysis and visualization, and was sort of completely enamored of this idea that we can't just let data scientists be the analysts and do the visualization, because actually we're not, we need them to focus on this, and we have other people who can do this kind of thing. Information design in general as a discipline, I think, is going to grow very much and is going to be very high demand. The tools are so new, the development tools, and there are new ones coming out all the time. It's just a burgeoning field. I think it's pretty exciting. If somebody does have an interest in information design, whether it's more on the data side or more on the design side or somewhere in between, I think there are real opportunities there.
Several questions here about how do you make sure that you can get this started on the right path in your organization. If people are just at the starting point with data viz, do you recommend that they set up some kind of demonstration project, i.e. that they attack one problem and show the rest of the organization? And can you talk about what you've seen organizations do?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start, is pick a project. Don't just say, okay, now we're going to be a visually driven company, right? That's sort of crazy. So pick a project. Pick a pretty modest project, actually. Identify the people who are not only capable, but enthusiastic, right? The worst thing you can do is tell people just, you are now going to do this whether you like it or not, and if they're not interested, that's not going to be great, right? And model, talk to other companies, talk to other people who have done this, model yourself on it. I'm always amazed at how many people who have sort of gotten into this say, well, met people online in a data viz community, and then I went and visited and saw how they did it. Just get out there and start talking to other people who have already started the process. But definitely smaller to start is better. Look for a small win. Look for a project that's manageable in scope and size, and for the right enthusiastic people to sort of start.
You mentioned the auto industry. Where else do you think that companies are really moving ahead with data viz?
On all fronts, but I would say the auto industry is sort of a really interesting one. Other manufacturing companies are very interesting.
Why is that so?
Well, if you think of where cars are in the history of the automotive industry, very mechanical industry, right? Cars are now driving computers. The amount of software in cars and the amount of data they generate is new and different, and these companies want to understand how to best use all of that information. They didn't grow up in sort of a data-driven sort of culture, but now their products are driving a lot of data. Pardon the pun about driving, but so I think that's one reason. I think anywhere where there's actually spatial information is really, this is happening quickly as well. Agriculture, contracting construction, large-scale construction, any kind of map-based deployment is happening as well. I think the sudden onset of drones, which is coming, pretty soon, if you think of drones as really just data collection vehicles, because that's what they are. Any company that's going to be deploying drones is going to have a lot of data it wants to analyze and understand. So I actually turn away from a lot of the sort of typical, I don't turn away, I shouldn't say that, but I don't think sort of in terms of like, the widget.com marketing group. Yes, that's going to happen there as well. But I think some of the sort of real innovation and change is going to come through some of these large-scale kind of industrial applications as well. I think there's exciting areas sort of all over.
So it's interesting that you seem to be saying that not everybody with big data is really great at data viz or really using it effectively?
Definitely not, yeah. There's a lot of, and I've heard this from CEOs of companies, say, they say, HBR did that big data story in 2011. I spent, $14 million on my big data deployment. I have no idea what I'm getting out of it, They say, well, do you get any dashboard? Do you get any, are you getting presentations that show, sort of visualize what, no, I don't know, So companies are trying. I'm not to say, I don't mean to be glib about it. It's a hard thing to do, right? And it's a very new discipline, but there's so much opportunity to do even better and to do sort of really interesting new things as well.
I mean, in fact, you seem to be saying that data viz might be a way to actually help the executives see the value of their big data and analytics.
Absolutely. It's in part a sales job. I mean, they're going to make better decisions, but they're going to realize it's a better way of working, right?
So I have one last question,
Sure.
And it's someone who says, I'm sold, love the idea, I don't have a lot of resources, we're not that kind of company, but I have an idea. So who do I need to go find? I don't have a ready-made team. Who do I need to go find to help me launch this?
There are a few information design consulting firms popping up. Some of the larger consulting firms also have information design practices. This is kind of an out there idea, but many universities now, computer science departments and also MBA programs and others, are starting sort of data viz curricula. And it might be an area to mine. I haven't looked too much into that, so I'm sort of speaking out of school here, but there's sort of people who are now sort of at the sort of academic level getting into this, right? And learning, and will probably want some opportunities, and could be a nice match there as well.
Great. Scott, this has been a great presentation, lots of great questions, but I'm afraid we're out of time.
Oh,
I want to thank you so much. I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and I want to thank TIBCO Spotfire for making this possible. This concludes our presentation. Have a great day.